We haven't yet talked about something that was like very important at the time and really occupied people's attention. After the plane disappeared, there was a lot of attention on the surface search, ships and airplanes, even satellites looking at the ocean surface to see if they could find the debris. And this is something that happens quite commonly when planes go missing or come to some kind of grief over the ocean. First thing you want to do is find the debris on the surface, and then that tells you more or less where the plane went missing, and then you can look on the seabed, see if you can find the wreckage, try to recover the black box, which has the recordings of the data, and the cockpit voice recorder, which has what people were saying to each other, and you can try to piece it together. Now, in the case of MH370, really what was front of mind for people was Air France 447, which we've mentioned a few times before on
Yeah.
this podcast. 2009, Air France plane en route from Rio de Janeiro to Paris had disappeared over the middle of the Atlantic, and it took them 2 years to find it. First, they found the floating debris, and then that told them more or less where they should look. But still, the ocean is deep and it's big, and it's a challenging thing. It took them 2 years, but once they found the wreckage, they quickly located the black boxes. And with that information, we were able to know exactly what happened to that plane. And it was sort of an unusual set of circumstances, some quirky quirks.
There were certainly were quirky quirks, and this is going to be kind of a visual episode. We're going to put a lot of graphics up on the screen, and we're going to explain this search radius, how it changed, where it went, where it started, and ultimately why they didn't really
Yeah.
find anything. First, everybody
Yeah.
thought the plane crashed in the South China Sea under its original route to Beijing, and it was a search and rescue mission, and that started right away.
Yeah. They always start optimistically, hoping that they'll find, maybe people floating in rafts or what have you. And so they call it search and rescue. And then eventually it becomes recovery and just trying to, find the wreckage. So with this one, as we know, March 8th, 2014, plane doesn't arrive in Beijing, seems to have disappeared out of the South China Sea. They spent a week looking for it in the South China Sea underneath the original route of the flight. But then, while they were still looking, there were these rumors going around that, oh, we saw it on primary radar. And they started searching to the west of Malaysia, over the Andaman Sea, halfway between Malaysia and India. And the thing I found just today, looking at putting this episode together, they started to search in the west the same day that the plane disappeared.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they took them a little while, because it took us a few days for people to sort of the rumor to spread that, oh, actually we saw it turn around. That's incredible to
It
me.
is incredible, and let's not minimize the search equipment that was out there. I was looking this up. I mean, right away they had 28 aircraft from the People's Republic of China, two of them from China, five of them from Japan, 10 of them from Malaysia, four from Singapore, one from Thailand, two from the United States, four from Vietnam, and then 34 vessels. So seven boats from China, 19 from Malaysia, three from Singapore, three from the United States, and two from Vietnam. So this was hardly just a couple people looking around for this thing.
It was a massive effort from the get-go. And even just in over the South China Sea, it was a massive search. Then they also started to search this other area. And so for a whole week, you've got massive searches going on in two kind of mutually exclusive areas. Why this was, it seems a little illogical, frankly. And, it's easy to, armchair quarterback it from 10 years later, but at the time there was a lot of
Yeah, so
confusion.
by that second search, they had moved up to 36 aircraft and 35 vessels, more or less the same countries, including also United Arab Emirates and New Zealand, Bangladesh. I mean, so now there are a whole bunch of people looking at this. But you're right, you found something new from this report in 2017, and my question to you
Yeah.
is, why were they looking where they were looking back on March 8th? Did they know something that we didn't know? And why didn't they tell us?
Well, they absolutely did. I mean, we knew it subsequently, but as I was saying, they clearly right away knew that this plane had turned around, and that it had flown towards the Andaman Sea. Why they would continue to look in the South China Sea, as we've discussed, there was some confusion as to whether this plane that flipped the Malacca Strait really was the
Yeah.
same plane. So maybe that was why, but it seemed like there was a massive penny to drop, and they kind of hit it.
Do you think
So,
that?
but anyway,
Yeah, I was
let's
just
not.
going to say. I mean, before we start blaming
Yeah.
Malaysia, do you think that they just weren't ready to make this information public, and that's why it took so long, or do you think there was gross incompetence going on here, or they're just looking everywhere and hoping to find something? Like, what's your impression on why the information was so slow to come out and why it impeded using those resources in what they believed would be the right place?
Yeah, that's a great point, because by looking in the South China Sea, they weren't using those assets to look where it more likely was. I think a combination of all the things you suggest, a certain degree of incompetence, a certain degree of being caught flat-footed, to a certain degree, just being a culture of secretiveness. I mean, these guys were eventually thrown
Yeah,
out of office. They were pretty incompetent and pretty corrupt. They were not great at being government officials. But I think it's one thing to say that these people were not very good at their job, and another thing to imply that they were somehow malign
right.
or engaged in some kind of conspiracy. I don't think that. I don't think that they were out there trying to weave a web of deception
I
around
don't
this
think so
case
either.
for
But
that
that
for
is
the
one of
job.
the reasons why people have such distrust for government and distrust for the authorities, because it would be very easy to see why they were sending these search and rescue and then just recovery ships and planes to the wrong place. And it was frustrating because you had the Tom Nod people who are wasting their time looking around in a place where the plane
Right.
obviously was, and those people were trying too. I mean,
Right.
they were doing the best they could.
It was annoying for journalists, but for the family members, it was another level of just it drove them crazy. They were in this horrible state of like not really grieving, but fearing for the worst and just emotionally wrung out. And here you had the officials not being straight with them. They got very, 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 very angry, and there were like actual like
There
semi-violent
were in
protests were
China,
going
which is
on.
not a place where that usually happens. So
No,
people were pretty fired
no.
up, and rightfully so.
So on March 15th, as we've spent a couple episodes talking about, this blockbuster news about the Inmarsat data was released. And now we suddenly knew, okay, forget the South China Sea, forget the Andaman Sea. This plane flew for a lot longer. It either went north to Kazakhstan or went south into South China Sea. And from the get-go, the majority suspicion was with the South China Sea. They just thought it went that way, and for reasons we've discussed. So where do you look? Now you've gone from these fairly small bodies of water to a vast body of water. And so they immediately dispatched airplanes. Ships take a little longer to get there. And they start looking at this area of the ocean where best guess says that the plane probably went. And we've talked before about how planes usually fly straight and high and fast. And if you assume that a plane did that, then the ping rings pretty much tell you where the plane went. And so very quickly they drew a circle in the ocean and they sent planes there, and the planes flew around, but only for like a couple
Okay.
days. And then they started to think about it, and they started to think, well, you know what? If we look at this radar data from the Malacca Straits, it seems like that plane was flying really, really fast. And if it was flying really fast, maybe it was burning fuel faster than we expected. So that means would have had less fuel, so it would have to fly more efficiently, and so it would have to fly slower. And to make slow speeds work with the ping ring, you get a curved path that goes further to the north.
Okay.
Now, we can talk about this more, but the upshot of it is that a curving path to the north is really unlikely. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And so they took their search planes away from an area that turned out to be really like the best, most probable place where the plane went, and started looking in some really low probability areas because they had kind of
Yeah.
psyched
Tell
themselves
me
out.
why flying a curved route is less efficient or less likely than flying a straight line.
So as I said, the rings tell you how fast a straight flight is, and that also tells you where it went. And so everyone assumes if they look at the data, oh, that's what happened to it. That's how planes fly. But it's also possible to fly more slowly. You can still connect your distance traveled to the space between the rings if you curve, if you go at an angle between each ring. And The problem with that is that if you allow the plane to fly in different ways, meaning if you say, okay, I'm going to allow this, I'm going to imagine this plane, instead of flying straight, which like if you were flying a jet over the ocean at night, there's no reason to turn. There's nothing to
Right.
avoid. There's no way that like your objective changed or something. There's no reason to fly in a curve. And so the search investigators did this kind of math game. They're like, okay, let's allow it to make a 10-degree turn every 30
Okay.
minutes or something. Or let's make it maybe a 50-degree turn every 20 minutes. And so the more you open up the possibilities, the universe of possible ways that a plane could fly if you allow this kind of behavior expands exponentially, right? And so the idea is that of all these thousands of things that could have happened if you allow this kind of behavior, it just coincidentally wound up flying a route that matched the straight
So
and
it'd almost
fast.
be like if you knew the ping rings were there and you were trying to hit them, you might
Right.
do something like that. But
Exactly.
if you didn't know the ping rings were there, it would be a very illogical way of flying a plane over the ocean.
Yeah, so a lot of people, I think, came up with the idea of like, well, maybe he was trying to be deceptive and he was trying to he was trying to fly in a way that made it look like he was going straight and fast, but he was really going curved things. A really, really, really important thing to understand, based on what we've been talking about in previous episodes, is that there's no way that if Zahari took this plane, he would have had any idea about ping rings and BFO values. We have to assume that there's no way he could have known about the ping rings. Because don't forget, even within the satellite communications industry, which is a very
Yeah.
specialized industry that he did
Yeah.
not belong to, nobody knew that they were recording this BTO data. So he would have absolutely no reason to think that they were recording it. So the analogy that I was telling you about earlier is, why is it unlikely that it was a curved path? And I said, okay, imagine we're in this town. So there's Andy's bar and there's Jeff's bar. And in Andy's bar, it's very straight. You just pay $5 for every beer. And at Jeff's bar, it's a little wacky. I make you roll a die, and that's how many dollars you pay for a beer. So it's either $1 or it's $6. And okay, so then your wife looks at your
Yeah.
credit card bill at the end of the month, and she sees how much money you've been spending on beer every day. And you're actually not that much of an alcoholic. You only had one beer per day, and this is how much you drank. You drank $5, $5, $5, $5, $5, $5, $5, $5, and $5.
Sure.
Right? So Andy, seeing that bill, which bar did
That
the
guy
guy
went
go
to Andy's
to?
bar for sure.
For sure, right? Because that's the telltale sign of Andy's
There's
bar.
$5
It's
a
always
beer.
$5. But wait, there's
Yeah.
more, because it's not actually true. It's very, very high probability that he went to Andy's bar, but there's another way to get it. He could have gone to Jeff's bar and just by chance rolled a 5 every single time. Now, if you're a normal person, you're like, that's ridiculous. That's incredibly unlikely. And indeed, the probability of that happening is 1/6 to the exponent of however many times he goes to the bars. So it's 1/6
Yeah.
on the first day, it's 1/36 on the second day, and it's like less than, I don't know, my math
But it
doesn't
gets
go
to
that
the
high.
point where it's
1 in
not real.
200. So the more turns and changes of speed you allow a plane to have in when you're imagining what this plane could have done, it's like going to the bar more and more days. And so further north you go, the more rolls of the dice you have to get in order to make it look like it was straight and fast, but it was really doing all these other crazy
And the
things.
reason we're telling people this is because they were looking for places that didn't really align with the data, right?
They were looking for places that made sense from a fuel burn and just assumed that somehow they would make the math of the turns work
Yeah.
out. And so the reason this matters is that they were searching with boats and with planes an area that was much further north than probably they should have had any reason
And
looking.
sure enough, they didn't find anything.
Time went
right?
by. They didn't see anything. In the course of moving the search area really far north, they started looking at dead center in the heart of where the high probability zone turned out to be, and then they skipped a pretty good zone that had a pretty high probability, and they went to some stuff that had a really low probability. So the fact that they didn't spot anything from the air might be that they just were looking in the wrong place.
Now you've moved on to the Australians who are running the show.
That's true.
I might have expected that from Malaysia. I feel like Australia would be more competent.
I think that the Australians had resources that the Malaysians didn't. They have an air transport safety bureau that's pretty active. It's pretty good. I'm genuinely impressed by the quality of their work. They also rush to some conclusions, as we'll see as we talk about what we're talking about today. It's just that once the Inmarsat data suggested an endpoint in the southern Indian Ocean, that lies within Australia's kind of global search and rescue responsibility area.
Maybe the fault here is expecting too much from too many people.
It was a very novel situation. It's a very challenging task to try to solve a kind of mystery, the likes of which has never been seen before. And so we're still learning. We're still learning from it. We still haven't found the plane, but hopefully our conversation in this podcast will help somehow.
So part 2 of this episode is the acoustic search for the underwater pings, and that loops back into this a little bit because on April 2nd they began looking for the black box, if I'm understanding this correctly. And the reason they did that was because of how long the batteries in the black box would continue to operate. And they did it all the way until April 7th, 2014.
As we were saying, what you want to do is find the surface debris floating around, and then you can try to find the wreckage on the bottom of the ocean. Now, to help you do that, the black boxes are equipped with these devices that, when submerged, will detect that they're submerged and start to emit an acoustic signal, a ping, an audible ping. It's actually too high for the human ear to hear, but it's like a sound, all right? And so your dog can probably hear it, maybe. I don't know. I'm speculating. But the battery for these acoustic pingers only last for a month. And so they were running out of time.
Can I ask you 2 questions about this? These are things that I've always wondered. Just as a civilian. First of all, why does the battery not last longer? Is it just the technology with the underwater pressure? I mean, like, they really can't make a black box that the battery lasts longer, or is it people expect to find the plane within a month and that's all they got?
Well, with anything in an aircraft, you're making a trade-off between weight and function, right? I think the thinking is, okay, if a plane crashes in the water, there's no way it's going to take us a month to find it. MH370 is very strange in that regard. So that's the reason why it only had a month.
Do more current planes or more recently built planes, do their batteries last longer, or is that still kind of the best practice that they last for a month?
I'm pretty sure it's the same. Well, and there's another reason why they wouldn't change it, which is that Air France 447, as I was talking about at the beginning of the episode, one of the reasons it took them so long to find it was that when they started looking on the seabed, they assumed that the black box pinger would be working, and so the fact that they hadn't detected the black box pinger meant that it might have just broken. We don't even know why. So
assuming a black box is functional, how far does it spread its ping? Do you know?
So it's about a mile or two, something on that scale. And if you think that this water could be 3 miles deep, that's problematic. So you have to actually dangle something on a line and drag it like underwater to try to detect it. So it's not great, but it's a lot better than not having any pinger at all, where you have to actually physically, put your scanner right over the actual wreckage. So they were hoping that they could save themselves a lot of grief if they could detect this ping. So we're talking about pingers, which are acoustic. They are sound traveling through the water.
We do know there is a frequency of 37.5 kilohertz. And that is a very specific number that is assigned to black boxes.
Now remember, they had calculated that this plane was somewhere in the 7th arc, but they didn't really know where. They'd been moving the search area up and down over the previous weeks, and they were running out of time. So they said, okay, you know what, we've got to just try. So let's lower a detector into the water and see if we hear anything. And lo and behold, they heard something. Now I was like, you're kidding me. Are you saying you just got that lucky right off the bat? I was suspicious. I'm a suspicious guy. Over the days that followed, they said, oh, we heard it. We heard it again. We heard it again. Most people who are more optimistic by nature were like, okay, great, we solved it. Because remember, we already pulled off the incredible feat. They didn't talk about how lucky they were that these numbers existed. You and I have been talking about it. They got really lucky that they had these numbers. They were impressed that they performed the prodigious feat of figuring out the math and calculated where it went. And now they got lucky by putting the thing in the water and they heard it. Everyone was completely convinced. I was going on CNN and all these people were like, yeah, we found the plane. Okay, it's just all we have to do is go find the pingers, find the black box. This is done and dusted. And I was like, don't be so quick. Anyway, they detected these pingers, but there were a couple of things that made me suspicious. One is that the location of the detections were like miles and miles apart. Now, this thing isn't moving around. It didn't land on the back of a giant turtle, and it's been walking around. So how could this stationary object be detected 10 miles apart when it only has a range of 2 miles? The other thing is that the frequency was wrong. It was being detected at 33 kilohertz. And these things are probably designed with an error of less than 1%. Okay, and 33 from 37.5 is like 10%, and there's just no way. It cannot be the same thing. And I went on air and it got very contentious. People are telling themselves stories to justify how this could be. And I actually went on a segment with Bill Nye, the science guy, and he says, oh, there's this thing called refraction. If you have two bodies of water that are slightly different, like salt density, the wave will get bent, and that'll change the frequency.
I was going to ask you about
and I'm
that,
like, you're Mr.
That's
Science.
not really how it works, huh?
Refraction does not change the frequency.
There haven't been black boxes found at the bottom of the ocean before, and those had the correct frequency.
To make a long story short, it was impossible. But nobody wanted to hear that. And so, but that to me was like, it was scary to me, Andy, because I was on TV, I was being seen by, potentially millions of people, and I'm saying all y'alls are wrong.
That must have been a really frustrating time for you.
I mean, we talked before about how I thought it went north, and then I realized I was wrong, and I had to walk it back, and it was embarrassing. But then this time, I kind of redeemed myself because it turned out I was right. Because they looked, and it wasn't there. They finally searched that seabed where they heard the pings, and there was nothing.
So what do they think it was?
They never said. You know what? They were wrong, and they just kind of let it go. And I think we're going to see this pattern later, where like authorities are going to make these big promises, and then when those big promises don't pan out,
we'll go on to the next thing.
I mean, people did speculate. There are like tags that people put on like marine mammals or sea turtles or try to track them, or and that have all kinds of different frequencies. So it might have been something like that. In fact, the lieutenant that we talked to in the first episode, he said that he thinks that they detected their own equipment, that they had like a test mode that generated like a test frequency, and that's what they detected, that they like set off their own equipment. And that is pretty plausible, actually. It sucks. But, but they just sort of let it slide. And then like a month later or 2 months later, the U.S. Navy said, oh, by the way, it wasn't it. Richard Quest, who I was going on with all the time, he really disagreed with me fundamentally about this case. But the one thing that he gives me credit for is he wrote a book about it later. And he said, like, Jeff, got over his skis, he said, about some of my ideas. But the thing that I got right was that I said the pingers, the acoustic pingers were not.
By the way, I did try to invite Victor Anelo on the podcast, and
I know, I saw you asked him on Twitter. That's fine. We know what he thinks. I think we're accurately portraying what he says and giving him credit.
I don't know what kind of enemies you've made, but those people are mad at you, Jeff.
People are mad at me, accused of like being a liar, but I'm not. But I think people are mostly mad at me because I don't agree with their theory. And I get lots of people writing me on Twitter saying like, you're a jerk, or all the different versions of jerk that you can think of. I don't think that's what happened. I'm like, I don't care what you think happened. I want to talk about what the evidence is and all the different hypotheses that could conceivably match.
But again, in this podcast, we're not saying we have every single answer.
We are gonna tell you what didn't happen. And people get mad about that. And lately, people are mad at me because there's video circulating about UFOs taking MH370 through a portal to another dimension. And I said to somebody today, I said, portals aren't real.
We're talking about it, and we welcome other voices on. Obviously, I want them to be rational and polite and respectful.
There aren't a ton of people who really understand the data. And so even if they don't like me or think I'm way off base, I am always happy to listen to them because they can tell us stuff that is true, and that we might not know. I'm all in favor of that. I think we should wrap up talking about the acoustic pinger. I think we pretty much did. This was the end of the attempt to find it. either on the surface or just the easy way by listening for it. Because once those two options go away, you have a very daunting task ahead of you, which is to try to figure out through math more precisely where it went and then scan.
No doubt it was some sort of wild goose chase, and it took the officials until you said late May to start to realize that this was not working out so well.
We learned something, which is that the authorities can say that they're very, very confident of something and they're wrong. And it's not because they're bad people or they're incompetent. It's just that they can get ahead of themselves. And as we saw before, I can get ahead of myself. People make mistakes. We're human. We're trying to do this thing. But just because someone with a fancy title says that they're absolutely sure that something is true, it might not be. So you have to just follow your own sense of how the science works and make
Okay.
your case.